and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. This week, last week or so, has added a whole new level of distress and a sense of a world out of control as we've looked at our news and seen what's been happening in America, and also the response on our own streets this weekend. Into a world already pausing and bewildered, caught up in a pandemic that has left us feeling isolated, shaken up and vulnerable. We have seen extreme measures of violence and marginalisation of those of different race and different colour. We have seen questionable actions of presidents of the United States. We have seen crowds dispersed by tear gas and presidents holding up Bibles in front of churches. We've seen the outrage of the church and the outrage of ordinary people like you and me in the face of such violence and such disregard of human rights and human dignity. Sometimes in our world, we can feel totally caught up and powerless. I've since given up a little bit in watching the news because I find it so destabilizing, so painful to see endless narratives of betrayal and violence and hatred and deliberate misinterpretation. It is very hard to feel at home in this world, particularly when many of us are still isolated, watching the news by ourselves, lacking the people that we trust to talk to. What kind of world is this? Well, in the ancient pagan world, people believed that violence was at the heart of everything, that violence defined what our world was like. And the only way to get ahead of the game, like those ancient gods, was to subdue others, to come in open warfare one with another, society against society, individual against individual. And sometimes it seems we haven't really grown up into any other sort of vision about our world. So often it feels the dominant and the strong are those who triumph, and the weak and the marginalized are simply pushed aside or eradicated violently. If we believe that violence is at the heart of our world, it means that justice, goodness, truth, beauty, and love have all been pushed away. It means that we are strangers and aliens to ourselves, to those deepest parts of who we are. So how might we find a way through this world? How might we find a home in it? I was thinking this week about different imaginations. So often we think when we turn on the news, we're just getting an objective portrayal of what our world is like. But as we ignore certain stories and focus on others, we're making an imaginative choice. We're deciding what we are going to believe about ourselves, our humanity, and our world. Are we simply going to believe that our world is lost to violence and misinterpretation and rivalry? Or can we dare to imagine something else? I was thinking of all my favourite children's stories like Harry Potter or C.S. Lewis, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, or The Wizard of Oz. All of these stories are about people who feel trapped in an imaginative world. We might think of Harry trapped in his cupboard under the stairs, with adults trying to make him believe that his world is small and mundane. Or we might think of those children in the Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, daring to go through the wardrobe to encounter a new world of magic and wonder and fairy story. Or the Wizard of Oz, as Dorothy tries to escape from the nasty people of her world, her black and white world, and is invited into a world of technicolor beauty and promise and magic. In many ways, the Christian faith is just like that. It's an invitation into another deeper world, not an escape into a fantasy where we think, well, actually violence doesn't really happen, or racism doesn't really happen, or where people aren't marginalized or hurt or killed, because we all know the truth of that world that is around us. But Christianity asks us to have the daring and imagination and faith to believe that even within that world, there's a deeper world that is trying to break through. That beyond all our violence, and it's not just a violence out there, it's a violence that we all have in our own hearts. But even deeper than that is the reality of God. A God who's not caught up in all of that. A God who doesn't need to prove himself. A God who doesn't need to eradicate others in order to find a place or find a home. But a God who is endless giving, endless loving. In our first reading today, the prophet Isaiah speaks into a world of violence and destabilization, a world in which the people of God have been shaken up by the power and violence of empire. And he reminds the people forcefully and powerfully that their God is not caught up in all of this violent and nasty history, that God is transcendent to it, that God is above that God's blessing and peace and justice derive from God's own eternity, a world that is deeper and more abiding than the temporary world that we live in. But strangely for Isaiah, this doesn't mean that God is distant from the world, but actually God visits the world in his endless creativity and generosity, that God comes to those who are weakened and wearied, that God meets with those on the edge of things, those who feel powerless and afraid, and God shares with them his inexhaustible truth and life and dynamism. So perhaps for each of us, or perhaps for those who are cast down by those who are powerful in the world, God can finally meet them in that moment of powerlessness. And it is where we help and reach out to others, giving them a voice, listening to their cries, hearing their cries for justice, that God is most active. In our gospel today, the newly risen Jesus tells his first disciples to go into all the world and to teach what he has taught and to baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This is not some colonial impulse to take over the world and make it the church's own territory, because the teaching of Jesus Christ is finally the teaching of forgiveness and love, to embrace the stranger, the person who is different from us, because we know that in that embrace, we are embracing God himself. To reach out to those who are marginalized with forgiveness and compassion and empowerment, to see where God is already at work in this amazing, complicated, and sometimes violent world. And of course, that command to baptize is Jesus telling us that we ourselves and others are to be immersed in this deeper reality. That beyond the violence and hatred and suspicion comes this deeper need, this deeper reality that we can immerse ourselves into. And this is the reality of God's life itself. And that is why Jesus says to baptize in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. just in front of the extraordinary flowers we have for Trinity Sunday today, and I don't know if you could all see it because it's tiny, is a very small representation of Rublev's Trinity. It's an icon I think many of you will know. Laura's holding up a bigger one so you can all see it there. And this is, I think, the invitation that we need at this time. It's an invitation into the very life of God that takes us out of isolation, beyond suspicion, beyond violence. Because here, God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the three figures in a perfect circularity of love, invite us right into the heart of God's own life. This icon is a riff on an Old Testament story where Abraham and Sarah in the desert with their tents pitched meet with three figures and they invite them into their home. We've been locked into our homes for quite some time now, but it seems to me that this is precisely the place, this domestic space where we can share a table with others, that we learn most deeply what it means to be at home with one another and be at home with God. Because round the table is where conversations happen, where people speak to one another in unguarded ways, where friendships are formed between those who are different. This is the reality of God in our midst, a God who invites us beyond suspicion, beyond hostility, beyond violence, into an everlasting relationship of love. And this is the God we worship, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.